The backhoe's engine idles low in the gray light of early morning. Its sound unervingly loud in a place meant for silence. On a hill above the town of Ruston Falls, men in reflective vests and paper suits stand in a tight circle around a single headstone. It is small, modest, and worn at the edges. The engraving reads, Emily Ann Carter, 1998 to 2017. Too gentle for this world. For nearly a decade, this grave has been the final word on Emily's story. A tragic suicide, a young woman who, according to official reports, chose to end her own life. Today, the ground beneath that story is about to be broken. A judge's order won after years of petitions, rejections, and appeals lies clipped to a clipboard, its seal catching the faint light. A county official reads it aloud, more for procedure than necessity. Everyone present already knows what it says. The grave of Emily Carter is to be as the first scoop of earth is lifted away, the camera cuts forward in time-brief flashes of moments that, taken together, will rewrite everything Ruston Falls thought it knew. A coroner on the witness stand, shoulders tight, voice low, admitting that he was encouraged to sign off on suicide, and that certain injuries were never documented in his original report. A former deputy, eyes describing a supplemental report he wrote about Emily's bruises and the state of the scene, a report he says went missing. After a closed-door meeting with the sheriff, a middle-aged man, gray at the temples, hands cuffed in front of him, being led through a courthouse hallway lined with cameras. For 2 decades, he was known here as a devoted father, a successful businessman, a pillar of the community. Now, reporters call him something else, the prime suspect in the murder of Emily Carter. Back at the cemetery, the exhumation continues. The bucket moves carefully, revealing the edges of a concrete burial vault. Workers trade shovels for hand tools. The pace slows. Every movement is deliberate. For years, Ruston Falls has told a simple story about this grave, that Emily was fragile, that a breakup, financial stress, or nameless personal struggles drove her to an irreversible decision. It was a narrative that made sense, that required no uncomfortable questions about power, influence, or responsibility. But that story came from the same small circle of men who controlled the sheriff's office, the coroner's office, and the local newspaper. Men whose children went to school with Emily. Men who had everything to lose if the truth looked different. As the lid of the vault is finally exposed and pried open, the contrast could not be sharper. The stillness of the cemetery, birdsong in the trees, flowers left by a grieving mother. Against the reality that beneath these carefully arranged symbols of peace, lies a body that may tell a very different story. This is where our investigation begins, at the moment when a town is forced to disturb its most carefully buried secret. Because if Emily Carter did not take her own life, then one question hangs over every shovelful of earth pulled from this grave. How does a murder get written out of the record? If you drive north out of the city for an hour and a half, the highways thin into 2-lane roads, and the landscape begins to flatten. Soybean fields, rusted barns, and windbreaks of cottonwoods stretch out in measured grids. Here, tucked against a slow, brown river, sits Ruston Falls. On paper, it looks like 100 other Midwestern towns, 18,000 residents. One public high school, the Ruston Falls Ravens. One community college satellite campus. A single aging hospital and a single dominant employer. Northline Manufacturing, the parts factory that kept 3 generations in mortgages and pickup trucks. But what made Ruston Falls feel different to the people who lived there was a quiet, shared belief. This was a place that still worked the way small towns were supposed to work. At least, that was the story they told themselves. The downtown, a few blocks of brick storefronts and awnings, hosted the same rhythm year after year. The parade on Independence Day. The fall festival with its bake-off and pie-eating contest. Friday night football under worn stadium lights that painted the field in soft, yellow haze. At the grocery store, older residents still wrote checks. Teenagers still bagged them. The sheriff's department was not just an institution here, it was part of the town's identity. Sheriff Tom Hayes had held office for over 20 years, winning every election by comfortable margins. His deputies weren't just badges and uniforms, they were neighbors. They coached Little League, supervised the high school's safe after prom, ran charity barbecues for families whose barns had burned down. On Sunday mornings, uniforms appeared in the front pews of half a dozen churches. The local paper, the Ruston Falls Gazette, rarely ran stories that upset this equilibrium. When crime was reported, it was almost always from somewhere else bigger cities, other states, the unsaid message was clear. Terrible things might happen, but not here, not to us. In Ruston Falls, problems were handled quietly. A teenage fight was sorted out by a deputy's firm talk behind the station. A drunk driving incident involving the right last name might vanish into a warning. The town prided itself on not airing its dirty laundry, confident that this discretion was a form of neighborly care rather than something more dangerous. Into this network of loyalty and silence, Emily Carter was born. By the time she turned 19, Emily's world was only a small sliver of Ruston Falls, but it was enough to hold an entire future. She lived in a 2-bedroom rental on the edge of town with her mother, Karen, and her younger brother, Josh. Her father had left when she was 11, leaving behind a shoebox of photographs and a string of promises that stopped coming. Emily picked up the slack early. After school, she helped Josh with homework and dinner while her mother worked double shifts as a nurse aide. On weekends, she waitressed at Miller's Diner out on Highway 7, refilling coffee for factory workers on their way to night shifts and families after church. The regulars knew her by name. They knew her laugh. Many of them watched her grow up from a shy middle schooler into a young woman who, according to everyone who spoke of her later, seemed older than her years. She was studying early childhood education at the community college. It wasn't glamorous, but to Emily, it was a step toward something that mattered. A stable job, a classroom of her own, maybe a life where kids felt as safe and seen as she sometimes hadn't. In her spare time, what little of it she had demily drew. Charcoal portraits, watercolor landscapes, doodles in the margins of her notebooks. Friends remembered stacks of sketchbooks piled beside her bed, half-finished scenes from around town, the old bridge, the high school bleachers, the view from her mother's kitchen window. She was not from one of the powerful families. She did not have a name that opened doors at City Hall or the sheriff's office. She was, in many ways, exactly the kind of person law enforcement is meant to protect: young, vulnerable, trying to build a life with limited resources and limited power. But in Ruston Falls, speaking out against the wrong person or the wrong person's child carried consequences. Jobs disappeared, social invitations dried up, rumors spread quickly in church parking lots and beauty salons. When the sheriff's department, City Hall, and the local paper formed a tight circle, there was no higher authority to appeal to without leaving town entirely. Emily lived her life under this unspoken architecture. Like most people her age, she barely noticed it. The deputy at the football game, the neighbor who worked at the courthouse, the teacher whose brother was a couple threads in the same fabric. Later, when questions about her death began to surface, that same fabric would close ranks around a version of events that was neat, contained, and convenient. A story in which no one in power had to answer hard questions. A story in which a 19-year-old girl's voice could be overridden by a line on a form, cause of death. Luke Hayes had always been one of Ruston Falls' success stories. In framed photos on the wall of Miller's Diner, you can still find him frozen in time. Number 12 jersey, helmet under his arm, grinning with his teammates after the Ravens won the regional championship. In a town where high school football was its own religion, Luke was once a kind of local celebrity. The sheriff's boy, the quarterback who could fake on Desatu if he'd really wanted it. By the time he met Emily, those glory days were already fading. AD 22, Luke was back in Ruston Falls, working off and on at his uncle's auto shop, taking occasional classes at the community college, drifting between odd jobs. But to people in town, he was still Luke from the game. Still the polite kid they remembered. Still the son of Sheriff Tom Hayes. Emily first knew him as a customer. He started coming into the diner more often on her shift, sitting at the counter instead of a booth, lingering over bottomless coffee refills, asking about her classes, her art, her plans. He was attentive in a way that, at first, felt flattering. Older, confident, someone everyone seemed to respect. Co-workers would tease her, "Sheriff's son has a crush," they'd say, half whispering as they passed. For a 19-year-old who'd grown up watching other girls date the star athletes and popular guys, it felt like finally being noticed. Their relationship moved quickly. Within weeks, Luke was picking Emily up after work, driving her out to the lake, talking about leaving town, about how different everything could be somewhere that isn't stuck in the past. He told her she was special, mature, not like the girls he'd dated in high school. To most people in Ruston Falls, it looked like a sweet story. The golden boy and the hard-working girl from the diner. Sheriff Hayes would nod at Emily when he came in, and regulars would comment on what a good match they made. But inside that story, another reality was taking shape. Friends later remembered subtle changes first. Emily, who had once posted sketches and candid photos all the time, began going quiet on social media. When she did post, Luke was in almost every picture, his arm around her shoulders, his hand on her waist. At the diner, co-workers noticed Luke waiting in the parking lot before her shifts ended, texting if she was even a few minutes late. He started dropping by during work, even when he had no reason to be on that side of town. Watching from a corner booth as she moved between tables, Emily brushed it off as him being protective. But her world was shrinking. There were the cancelled movie nights with friends because Luke had a bad day. The group chat messages unanswered because we're just hanging out, just us tonight. The way she stopped staying late after class to work on art projects if Luke was texting, asking where she was. Then there were the marks, a line of bruises along her forearm, half hidden under long sleeves in early fall. A split lip she dismissed as I bumped into a cabinet. Each time, she had an explanation ready, too ready, delivered with a quick laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Her best friend, Hannah, would later describe late-night phone calls where Emily's voice shook as she talked about arguments that escalated without warning, about Luke going through her phone, questioning every male contact, accusing her of flirting if she didn't respond fast enough. More than once, Emily said she was thinking about breaking up with him. But underneath that thought was fear not just of Luke's reaction, but of what it would mean to go up against the sheriff's son in Ruston Falls. She worried about gossip, about being painted as dramatic or unstable, about what might happen if she reported anything, and the deputies who showed up at her door answered first to their boss, not to the law. To the town, Luke remained the smiling ex-quarterback from a good family. Behind closed doors, he was becoming someone else entirely. Possessive, volatile, increasingly convinced that Emily was his to monitor, to correct, to keep. It was within that imbalance between his social power and her vulnerability, between the public fairy tale and the private fear that the danger around Emily quietly escalated, one red flag at a time. On the night Emily disappeared, almost everything she did looked like part of a normal routine. According to Miller's Diner's time cards, her shift on that Thursday started at 3 p.m. and was scheduled to end at 9 o'clock. The dinner rush was steady but unremarkable families, factory workers, a group of high schoolers, still in Ravens hoodies. Security footage later reviewed for the investigation shows Emily moving quickly between tables, ponytails swaying, not lingering anywhere for long. At 8:07 p.m., her phone records show a text to her friend Hannah, off at 9. Movie at your place? Hannah responded a few minutes later with a list of streaming options and a row of heart emojis. There was no indication, at that point, that anything was wrong. At 8:24 p.m., another conversation starts, this one with Luke. It begins with a simple message from him. Where are you? When she answers that she's still at work, his texts become more insistent. Phone records and later screenshots provided by Hannah show a series of messages over the next half hour. We need to talk. Not over text. Come over after. Emily replies at 8:41 p.m. I'm really tired. Going to Hans. There's a 3-minute gap. Then, from Luke, if you don't come, I'll just come find you. I'm done with this. Co-workers later recalled that around this time, Emily seemed distracted, checking her phone between tables, her expression tightening with each buzz. One waitress remembered Emily asking if she could leave a few minutes early to make it to a friend's place. Voice low, trying to sound casual. Her last transaction at the register is at 8:57 p.m. At 9:03 p.m., a camera over the diner's entrance captures her stepping out into the parking lot, shrugging into her jacket, keys in hand. From there, the timeline shifts from eyewitness accounts to digital trace. At 9:12 p.m., Emily's car is seen on gas station CCTV, 3 miles down, Highway 7. She pays cash for $10 worth of fuel, something her mother would later say was typical when Emily was stretching tips between paychecks. She texts Hannah at 9:16 p.m., running a little late, might stop somewhere first. It's the last message Hannah ever receives from her. Between 9:20 and 9:30 p.m., Emily's phone shows her car moving along County Road 14, the back way out toward the Hayes property and the sheriff's larger, rural home. A neighbor on that road would eventually tell investigators that they saw a small silver sedan they believed was Emily's pass by around 9:30, heading toward the ridge where the Hayes house sits, lights on inside. From 9:31 to 10:12 p.m., there is no outgoing activity from Emily's phone, no texts, no calls. But cell tower records, pulled much later, indicate that the device stayed in the same general sector, an area that includes the sheriff's property and the surrounding woods. At 10:21 p.m., Luke's phone pings off the same tower for the first time that evening, placing him in that same rough radius. The final digital trace from Emily's phone occurs at 10:37 p.m. A brief, unsent text draft is logged in her phone's memory. One word started and never completed. Immediately after, the device stops transmitting entirely. No battery drain pattern, no gradual loss of signal. Just a sudden, sharp end. To anyone driving those roads that night, it was an unremarkable Thursday. Headlights along dark country lanes, a girl in a silver car heading somewhere. To Hannah, waiting on her couch, it was an annoying delay from a friend who was always running late. But when the night is reconstructed years later, message by message, camera frame by camera frame, the ordinary texture of the evening falls away. What remains is a path that narrows steadily toward one place, the outskirts of the Hayes property. And in that context, knowing Luke's temper, his insistence that they talk, and his family's control over what did and did not become a case file, Emily's last drive through those familiar roads takes on a very different meaning. The call came in just after 7 o'clock a.m. the next morning. A man named Carl Jenkins, a machinist from Northline Manufacturing, had driven out to his usual fishing spot on the Little Ruston River before his shift. The place was a narrow pull-off, just outside town limits, a dirt turnout, leading to a short trail down into the trees, where an old cottonwood leaned over the water. Carl had been coming there twice a week for nearly 15 years. He knew every rut in the ground, every bend in the trail. On that morning, something was wrong. The moment he stepped out of his truck, his eyes caught the flash of color, first a pale shape through the trees where there should have been nothing but trunks and undergrowth. As he got closer, following the narrow path, the shape sharpened into a figure hanging from a low branch, feet not far above the ground. He backed away and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The recording of that call would later be played in court. Carl strained attempts to describe an impossible scene. The dispatcher's calm, rehearsed questions, his voice cracking as he realized the person hanging from the tree was a young woman and that she was not breathing. Because the site was just beyond the town limits, jurisdiction fell squarely to the Ruston Falls Sheriff's Department. Deputies arrived within 10 minutes. Their dashcam footage, which surfaced years later, shows two patrol vehicles pulling into the turnout, lights spinning red and blue in the early morning mist. The camera angle captures fragments. Boots moving down the path, the edge of yellow crime scene tape being unrolled, the top of the cottonwood's branches shaking slightly in the breeze. What the dashcam does not show, but witnesses later testified to, is who else arrived and how quickly. Carl remembers a third vehicle pulling up before the deputies had been on scene for more than a few minutes. The sheriff's black SUV. Sheriff Tom Hayes stepped out, his son Luke in the passenger seat. By the time the county medical examiner, Dr. Abata, longtime friend of Hayes, reached the scene, the area had been partially secured, but several key decisions had already been made. The case was being treated, from the beginning, less like a crime scene, and more like a tragic, self-inflicted death. On paper, the narrative came together with striking speed. The initial incident report described Emily as found suspended from a low-hanging branch by a length of rope, with no signs of obvious struggle in the immediate vicinity. An empty prescription pill bottle lay in the brush nearby, labeled in her name. For a low-dose anti-anxiety medication she'd been given months earlier after a minor panic attack during exams. Within hours, that bottle would loom large in the official story. By early afternoon, deputies had visited Emily's mother, Karen, ostensibly to notify her of the tragic news, but also to ask pointed questions. Had Emily seemed sad lately? Had she ever talked about self-harm? Had there been drama with a boyfriend? In her saw, Karen mentioned the tension with Luke, the late-night arguments, the way her daughter had seemed more withdrawn in recent weeks. She also mentioned Emily's habit of talking things out, her plans for the next semester, the way she'd just helped Josh with a school project the night before. In the eventual report, only the relationship stress and mention of a past prescription would be highlighted. By the end of that same day, Dr. Abbott had completed a preliminary examination and, in consultation with Sheriff Hayes, was prepared to mark the manner of death as suicide. The document cited a known history of anxiety, recent emotional distress related to a romantic relationship, body found in circumstances consistent with self-inflicted hanging, no evidence of third-party involvement observed at scene. What the report did not emphasize, or mentioned only in vague language, were the details that didn't fit so neatly. Bruising along Emily's jaw and upper arms that, according to later experts, were more suggestive of gripping fingers than of a fall. Horizontal marks around one wrist consistent with some form of restraint. Lividity, patterns the way blood settled in her body after death that did not perfectly align with the position in which she was discovered hanging, suggesting she may have been moved. These anomalies were either minimized as non-specific or attributed to post-mortem changes. That evening, the Ruston Falls Gazette ran a brief story on its website. Updated in the next day's print edition, local teen found dead in apparent suicide. The article was almost entirely a reprint of the sheriff's press release. It included Sheriff Hayes' quote, calling it a tragic loss for our community, and assuring residents there was no indication of foul play or danger to the public. There were no follow-up questions about why he and his son had been at the scene so quickly, no inquiry into the nature of Luke's relationship with Emily, no mention of any forensic inconsistencies. For the town, the phrase, tragic loss, no foul play, suspected closed the file as effectively as any lock. For Emily's family, it was the beginning of a second trauma, layered on top of the first. Their immediate visceral certainty that their daughter had not chosen to die, set against an official narrative that insisted she had sealed by signatures and stamps. In the official records of Ruston Falls, the story of Emily Carter ended the day her death certificate was signed. The case file went into a gray metal cabinet at the sheriff's department, labeled and logged like dozens of others. On paper, it was closed, resolved. Another line in an annual report that continued to boast a low rate of violent crime. Outside the paperwork, it was never that simple. In the months after Emily's funeral, people lowered their voices when her name came up. At the diner, regulars would glance toward the window where she used to refill their coffee and fall quiet. At church, casseroles and condolences gave way, slowly, to well-intentioned platitudes. You have to let her rest, Karen. Sometimes we don't get answers this side of heaven. She was hurting more than anyone knew. But Karen Carter did not believe that. Not then. Not a year later. Not ever. On her kitchen table, she kept a cardboard box that grew heavier with time. Inside were copies of every document she could get her hands on. The autopsy summary, the incident report, printouts of Emily's last text messages, a rough sketch she'd made of how her daughter's body had been found based on what little she'd been told. She wrote letters first to Sheriff Hayes, then to the county prosecutor, then to the state attorney general's office. She asked about the bruises, about the position of the body, about why no one had taken a detailed statement from Luke. Most of her letters went unanswered. The responses she did receive were polite, brief, and circular. The case had been thoroughly investigated. There was no evidence contradicting the suicide ruling. Still, people talked. A nurse from the hospital mentioned, after a few glasses of wine at a neighborhood barbecue, that she'd heard one of the deputies had concerns about the scene. A cashier at the grocery store claimed she'd seen Luke in town the night of the death, looking like he'd been in a fight. A former classmate whispered to Karen that Emily had confided in her about being scared to leave the relationship. Karen followed every thread. Met strangers in coffee shops, wrote down snippets of hearsay on notepads she kept beside the phone and next to her bed. For most people, these were passing comments. For her, they were pieces of a puzzle that refused to go together under the picture the sheriff's office had supplied. Inside the department, that picture was enforced. One deputy who quietly raised questions about the timeline found himself reassigned to courthouse security. Another, who privately suggested they should have treated the river site as a potential homicide scene from the beginning, left for a job in a neighboring county. Those who stayed learned from example. You did not reopen the Carter file. You did not question the sheriff's son. You did not stir up old grief. Years passed. New tragedies, new headlines, and the slow churn of daily life layered over Emily's absence. And then, almost by accident, her name surfaced in front of someone whose job it was to notice when stories didn't add up. A regional crime podcaster, Jenna Morales, was interviewing a retired deputy for a series on small-town policing when he mentioned, offhand, a case that still bothers me. He didn't give many details, just a dead girl, a fast ruling, and a feeling that things weren't done by the book. Later, cross-referencing dates and places, Jenna found a brief, forgotten article from the Ruston Falls Gazette about a local teen's apparent suicide. No follow-ups, no obituary linked. Just a name, Emily Carter. She wasn't the first person to feel that something about Emily's death was wrong. She would be the first in years, with a platform and the persistence to start pulling on that thread in public. By the time Jenna Morales found Emily's name in an old PDF of the Ruston Falls Gazette, almost a decade had passed. Jenna was used to reading between the lines of small-town reporting. As a regional crime podcaster based 2 counties over, she'd built her audience on stories that never made national news, but left deep scars locally. What caught her eye in the brief about Emily wasn't just the bare-bones language, it was the speed. Local teen found dead in apparent suicide. No foul play suspected. No follow-up. No obituary linked. No mention of a vigil, a memorial, or even a quote from family. For a 19-year-old in a town of 18,000, the silence felt heavy. She filed her first records request a week later, asking the Ruston Falls Sheriff's Department for the incident report, autopsy summary, and any supplemental documents related to Emily Carter's death. What she got back was almost nothing. The file, when it arrived, was startlingly thin. A 4-page incident report, heavily redacted autopsy notes, and no scene photographs. No detailed diagrams. No recorded witness statements, beyond a couple of perfunctory lines. A brief letter from the sheriff's office claimed that certain materials could not be released due to ongoing sensitivity for the family. When Janae called Karen Carter to confirm that, Karen's response was quiet but immediate. Ongoing sensitivity. She said, "No one has called me about Emily's case in 9 years." Around the same time, Ruston Falls itself was changing. A new district attorney, Cameron Blake, had been elected on a platform of transparency and accountability after a series of controversies in neighboring counties. He'd grown up an hour away, went to law school out of state, and returned with fewer local loyalties and fewer debts than his predecessors. On his first pass through old case summaries, something about Emily's file bothered him too. A death of a 19-year-old labeled suicide, closed in under 24 hours, with almost no documentation of alternative possibilities. A note that the sheriff's son had been interviewed with no transcript attached. For several months, Jenna and Da Blake circled the same questions from different directions, unaware of each other. Jenna started where she always did. With people. She drove to Ruston Falls, sat at Karen Carter's kitchen table, and listened. She interviewed Hannah, Emily's brother Josh, and former co-workers from the diner recording hours of audio about who Emily was, what her life looked like before she died, and all the things that never made it into the official narrative. She compared the sheriff's written policies on unattended deaths, on suicides, on potential conflicts of interest with what had actually happened in Emily's case. The gaps were glaring. On her podcast, she released a 3-part series titled The Carter File. She didn't accuse anyone outright, but she laid out facts. The timeline, the relationship with Luke, the rapid ruling of suicide, the thinness of the documentation, the speed with which the town seemed eager to move on. Listeners responded, some from Ruston Falls, some from far away. On social media, strangers began asking public questions that locals had only whispered. Why had no external agency reviewed the case, given the sheriff's connection? Why were there no scene photos in a death investigation? Why was ongoing sensitivity being used as a shield against basic transparency? That online noise eventually reached DA Blake's office. A junior staffer forwarded him a link to Genesis' podcast with a note. "We have this case in our archives, might be worth a look." When Blake put the podcast findings beside the official file, the dissonance was too great to ignore. Privately, he requested access to the full, unredacted materials from the sheriff's department and hit the same wall Jenna had. Missing evidence, vague references to documents that could no longer be located, and a reluctance that felt less like caution and more like protection. The difference now was that Ruston Falls was no longer sealed off from scrutiny. What might once have stayed a local rumor was now a public conversation, shared, downloaded, and debated far beyond county lines. In the era when Emily died, a sheriff could close a case and expect that to be the end of it. In the era of podcasts, FOIA appeals, and viral threads, that closure began to look less like an endpoint and more like an open challenge. By the time the state got involved, Ruston Falls was no longer just a dot on a map. Jenna's podcast episodes had been shared tens of thousands of times. A regional TV station had run a segment on the Carter case, showing side-by-side shots of Emily's smiling graduation photo and the wooded patch by the river where her body was found. Underneath every clip, the same questions multiplied in the comments. How does a 19-year-old's death get ruled a suicide in under 24 hours? Why was the sheriff's son never properly interviewed? Where are the scene photos? For years, Karen Carter's letters had gone unanswered. Now, the calls and emails coming into the State Attorney General's office weren't just from one grieving mother. They were from journalists, advocacy groups, and ordinary viewers who had listened to Jenna's work and wanted to know why no one with real power was looking. Eventually, someone did. Within the Attorney General's office, there was a small unit tasked with reviewing questionable convictions and officer-involved incidents. They typically focused on big city shootings or high-profile wrongful convictions. But the pattern in Emily's case, youth, domestic connection, rapid closure, conflict of interest fit every red flag criterion they had. The decision was made to open a preliminary inquiry. On paper, it began with a polite letter. The AG's office formally requested the complete, unredacted file on Emily Carter's death from the Ruston Falls Sheriff's Department and County Coroner, incident reports, supplemental reports, photographs, witness statements, autopsy records, internal communications. Standard procedure. What came back again was not standard. The packet was thinner, in fact, than the version Jinnah had obtained through her early FOIA requests. Several items referenced in the original incident report, see attached photographs, see supplemental statement by responding deputy, were simply missing. No explanation, no notation. Internally, the AG's office shifted from preliminary inquiry to something more serious. Subpoenas followed. What had been a request became an order. Investigators from the state drove down to Ruston Falls, not for a courtesy visit, but with the authority to inspect records on site. They arrived without fanfare, checked into a motel off the highway, and the next morning walked through the front door of the sheriff's department with a list of what they needed. They were met immediately with resistance. A captain explained, with practiced politeness, that some files had been archived off-site and would take time to locate. A records clerk insisted that certain emails no longer existed due to routine system purges. When state investigators asked for any body cam footage from the morning Emily's body was found, they were told that deputies weren't consistently using cameras back then, despite policies saying otherwise. Each missing piece deepened their concern, so they widened the scope. They pulled dispatch logs and 911 audio from the night Emily disappeared and the morning she was found. They audited the department's call response times and compared them to policy. Had Emily been classified as a missing person when her mother called, or informally treated as a likely runaway, without the required paperwork? They reviewed how unattended deaths and suspected suicides were supposed to be handled under state guidelines. Scene preservation, mandatory photographs, consideration of third-party involvement, especially in cases involving young victims or complicated personal relationships. On those checklists, Emily's case failed almost every point. The more they dug, the more patterns emerged. A supervisor's handwritten note rescued from a backup tape after the original paper went missing showed that the first deputy on scene had initially marked the manner of death as undetermined pending further investigation. That undetermined had been crossed out and replaced in different ink with suicide after a meeting attended by Sheriff Hayes. Internal emails, reluctantly handed over after legal pressure, revealed exchanges between the sheriff and the coroner, Dr. Abbott, discussing keeping this from becoming a circus and avoiding the need for external review, given family connections. There were other troubling signs. An entire folder referenced in a digital log as seen photos, Carter that could no longer be located. A supplemental report written by a now retired deputy that mentioned bruising patterns on Emily's arms, logged in the system, but with its attachment file corrupted or intentionally as the state's presence became harder to ignore, the sheriff's department circled the wagons. Union lawyers advised officers to say as little as possible. Some were instructed to answer. I do not recall two questions about a case that had, for many of them, been one of the most memorable scenes of their careers. Hallway conversations died when state investigators walked past. Not everyone was comfortable with that. A few deputies, especially those who had been younger, lower-ranking officers at the time of Emily's death, found themselves pulled in two directions. On one side was loyalty to the department. Two colleagues to a man who had signed their evaluations and attended their kids' graduation parties. On the other was the nagging knowledge that corners had been cut, that doubts they'd swallowed years earlier were now coming back with evidence attached. One former deputy, now working in a neighboring county, decided he couldn't stay silent, off the record at first, then under formal protection. He told state investigators about his original notes from the scene. The grip-shaped bruises, the lack of disturbed foliage around the tree, the way Sheriff Hayes had told him. in no uncertain terms. "We're not turning this into a homicide witch hunt." Another, still employed in Ruston Falls, quietly handed over a thumb drive he'd kept at home, a personal backup of photographs he'd taken that morning, unsure even then if they'd survive in the official system. Those images, when analyzed by independent forensic experts, would later be compared to the autopsy findings and to the first, sparse report. The discrepancies were impossible to ignore. What began as a quiet review had become, slowly but unmistakably, an unraveling. The contrast could not have been sharper. Inside the sheriff's department, for years, the culture had been one of loyalty and containment. Problems were handled in-house. Questions were deflected. Iron Woman's death had been folded into a narrative that protected the powerful and closed the door on scrutiny. From the outside, the state investigators brought a different mandate. Impartiality, documentation, accountability. They weren't from Ruston Falls. They didn't owe anyone there a favor. Their job wasn't to preserve reputations. It was to reconcile what the record said with what the evidence showed on. Increasingly, those two stories did not match. For the officers and staff caught in the middle, the process was painful. It meant admitting, if only to themselves at first, that going along with an easy answer years ago had helped bury a harder truth. For Emily Carter's family, and for everyone watching by then, it meant something else. For the first time, someone with real authority was saying, out loud, what they had suspected all along, that the official story of Emily's death was not just incomplete, it was wrong. When the results of the second autopsy were finally unsealed, they did what years of rumor and suspicion had never been able to do. They broke the silence. The independent forensic pathologist's report was blunt in a way the first one had never been allowed to be. Where Dr. Abbott had written findings consistent with self-inflicted hanging, the new report used different words. Findings inconsistent with suicidal hanging, high likelihood of manual strangulation or homicidal asphyxia prior to staging. It listed, in clinical detail, the evidence. Deep bruising on both sides of Emily's neck, in patterns more consistent with fingers than with a rope. Petechial hemorrhages in her eyes, typical of strangulation. Lividity, suggesting her body had been lying horizontally for some time before being positioned in a semi-suspended posture. Contusions on her upper arms and wrists that matched patterns of gripping and possible restraint. At a press conference, the state investigators stopped just short of saying murder, but everyone understood. The official manner of death on Emily Carter's certificate was changed from suicide to homicide by unspecified means. Once that word homicide entered the record, people who had held their doubts in check for years began to talk. The first was a former deputy, Steve Randall, now working security for a warehouse 3 towns over. He contacted the AG's office through his lawyer, asking for whistleblower protections. In a closed-door interview, he admitted what his original scene notes had contained: observations of irregular bruising on neck and arms, minimal disturbance of ground around tree, and his recommendation that the death be listed as undetermined pending further investigation. Those words had never appeared in the final report. Randall testified that after he turned in his draft, he was called into Sheriff Hayes' office. When he came out, undetermined had been crossed out and replaced with suicide. His supplemental memo describing the bruising must have gotten lost. He wasn't the only one. Another former detective, Maria Lopez, who had left the department a few years after Emily's death, told investigators that in the early hours of the case, Luke Hayes had been informally flagged as a person of interest. His alibi for that night was shaky. His relationship with Emily was known to be volatile. According to Lopez, she'd begun drafting an interview plan and a request to collect Luke's clothing and phone records when she was summoned to a meeting with the sheriff. There she said she was told in no uncertain terms that we are not turning this into a witch hunt against my son, and that any mention of Luke as a suspect should be removed from internal documents. If her account had stood alone, it might have been dismissed as sour grapes. But the digital trail backed her up. State IT specialists, combing through old backups and email archives, recovered deleted messages between Sheriff Hayes, Dr. Abbott, and key supervisors. In one thread sent the day after Emily's body was found, Hayes wrote, "We need to protect the department from scandal. This stays a suicide. Do not reignite this case with speculation." In another, a captain instructed subordinates, "All inquiries on Carter go through me. No independent statements. No further scene work unless ordered. We are not reopening." The phrase, "do not reignite" the Carter case appeared more than once. A quiet directive that had shaped departmental behavior for years. Individually, each piece of evidence could be explained away. Together with the new autopsy, the missing photos, the altered reports, and now first-hand accounts of interference. They formed a picture that even the most cautious prosecutor could not ignore. The AG's office convened a grand jury. Over weeks of testimony, jurors heard from forensic experts, from former deputies, from Jenna, and from Karen Carter herself. They saw side-by-side comparisons of the original and independent autopsy findings. They read the emails in which a sheriff discussed a teenager's death in terms of public relations instead of justice. In the end, the grand jury issued 2 sets of indictments. The first was for Luke Hayes, second-degree murder, with special allegations of committing the offense during a pattern of domestic abuse. The charge sheet laid out a theory. Prosecutors were now prepared to argue in open court that, during a violent confrontation on the night Emily disappeared, Luke had killed her, then, with help or direction, staged the scene by the river to look like suicide. The second set of charges targeted the man who for 20 years had been the face of law and order in Ruston Falls. Sheriff Tom Hayes was indicted for tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, and official misconduct. The morning of the arrests, it was not a familiar black SUV pulling up to a scene, but state cruisers. Neighbors watched as Luke, older now, heavier, was led from his house in handcuffs. A second team went to the sheriff's home. Cameras captured Hayes on his own front porch, the badge still on his belt, as another officer read him his rights. For the first time, the family that had once been insulated by the power of the uniform stood on the other side of it. The blue wall that had protected them for nearly a decade was cracking in through those cracks. At last, Emily Carter's real story was beginning to emerge. The trial of Luke Hayes, and, separately, of his father, did more than fill a courtroom in the county seat. It forced Ruston Falls to sit with 2 competing versions of its own history. In the state's case against Luke, prosecutors opened by playing a montage of evidence that, years earlier, had never been assembled in one place. Juries heard Emily's voice in late-night voicemails to Hannah, wavering between love and fear. They saw text messages from Luke that moved from charm to threat in a matter of lines. "If you walk away from this, I swear you'll regret it." They walked the jury, step by step, through the night Emily disappeared. The diner footage, the gas station camera, the cell phone pings drawing a path toward the Hayes property, and the sudden digital silence at 10:37 p.m. Then came the science. The independent pathologist explained, in calm, precise language, why Emily's death could not be what it had been called for nearly a decade. Photos of bruising, neck injuries, and lividity patterns were shown not for shock, but to make the difference between a staged suicide and a real one impossible to ignore. Former deputies testified under subpoena. Some spoke about the scene that morning by the river. Others described internal decisions. A draft report changed, a promising lead cut off, an unwritten rule that we don't build cases on the sheriff's family. Taken together, the prosecution's narrative was clear. Emily had been trapped in an abusive relationship. One night, it escalated to lethal violence, and afterward, people in power had prioritized their own protection over the truth. The defense tried to pull the story back toward ambiguity. They called classmates who said Emily had been emotional and dramatic at times. They suggested she struggled with mental health more than her family admitted. They painted Luke as a young man overwhelmed, someone who snapped in an argument, then panicked, confused, not calculating. When it came to the cover-up, they attempted to draw a line. Whatever the sheriff had done after the fact, they argued, was not proof that Luke himself was a cold-blooded killer. Outside the courthouse, Ruston Falls split almost along generational lines. Older residents, many with long ties to the Hayes family, spoke bitterly to local reporters about outsiders dragging the town through the mud. Some insisted the sheriff had only tried to spare the community more pain. Younger people, and those who had long felt the weight of unequal policing, saw something different. Confirmation of what they suspected for years, that there were 2 systems of justice here, and Emily had been on the wrong side of both. After weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury in Luke's case returned its verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder and evidence tampering. It was an acknowledgement that what happened to Emily was not an accident or a mystery. It was a crime. Faced with that verdict and the threat of a separate trial that would expose even more internal communications, Sheriff Tom Hayes accepted a plea deal. Conviction on multiple counts of obstruction of justice and official misconduct, loss of his badge and pension, and a prison sentence that, while shorter than many wanted, marked him forever as a felon. For the first time in any official proceeding, the record now said plainly what Karen Carter had known from the beginning. Her daughter had been killed, and those entrusted with the law had broken it to hide that fact. For Karen Carter, there was no real after. The verdicts did not bring Emily back. They did not erase the years she had spent doubting her own sanity, wondering if she was the only one who saw what had really happened. But they did something important. They put, in black and white, what the system had tried to deny. Her daughter's name no longer sat beside the word suicide. It sat beside the word homicide. In the months and years that followed, that single correction rippled outward. At the state level, lawmakers used the Carter case as a catalyst. New statutes required that any sudden or suspicious death involving a family member of law enforcement be automatically referred to an outside agency for review. Autopsy findings in such cases could no longer be finalized without sign-off from an independent pathologist. Procedures around youth suicides were tightened. 2. Departments were now required to photograph scenes, collect potential evidence, and fully document alternative manners of death even when initial appearances suggested self-harm. Quick closure was no longer considered a virtue. Ruston Falls itself could not change as easily as a policy manual, but it did begin to change. A civilian review board was created, made up of clergy, teachers, and local business owners, with the authority to audit closed cases and complaint histories. Mandatory training on domestic violence and coercive control was instituted, not just for deputies, but for school counselors and hospital staff, focusing on the patterns that had been present in Emily's relationship long before the night she died. In conversations at the diner, in pews, on front porches, people began to say things out loud they once would have swallowed, that they'd been afraid to question the sheriff, that they'd ignored red flags because Luke came from a good family. That silence, marketed as dignity and discretion, had really been fear. For decades, Ruston Falls had wrapped itself in a belief: we keep our problems quiet to protect our reputation. The Carter case forced an uncomfortable realization that secrecy had not protected the town. It had protected the people who hurt Emily and the people who failed her. Slowly, another ethic started to take root. That real safety depends on transparency, on listening to the least powerful voices, and on being willing to say, something is wrong here, even when it implicates those we were raised to trust. For viewers, Emily's story is more than a narrative about one small town. It's a reminder that red flags in relationships, jealousy framed as protection, isolation disguised as love, fear of retaliation are not drama. They are warning signs. It's a reminder that when an official story feels too neat, too fast, or too convenient, it is not disloyal to ask for evidence. It is necessary. And it is a reminder that justice, especially in places where everyone knows everyone else, often depends on the people who refuse to let a file stay closed, simply because it's easier that way. Mothers who keep every document, officers whose conscience outweighs their fear, journalists and advocates who keep asking questions long after the cameras move on. For nearly 10 years, Emily Carter's death was the crime they tried to bury. It took persistence, courage, and the willingness to confront power to bring it into the light. The next time a case is labeled tragic, no foul play is suspected and quietly filed away. Whether in a town like Ruston Falls or in your own community, the lesson of Emily's story is simple. Look closer, ask why, and stand with those who aren't ready to accept an answer that doesn't fit the facts.